Yes, sir.
Welcome, everyone, and welcome, Brian. Brian, how's it going?
Not too bad, thanks. Yeah, all
It's
good.
great to have you on the very first episode of the Storytellers Club. How does it feel to be number one?
I am very excited and only found that news out about 20 seconds ago, which makes it even more exciting.
As I said, you're number one in more ways than one. You're a number one man. But thanks for joining us, and I want to use this opportunity just to get to know Brian a little bit better, and then maybe see what advice he has to offer us. So, Brian, tell us a little bit about yourself. Who are you? Where are you from? What are you up to?
Sure. I'm Bryan Stewart. I'm 26 years old.
It's funny, isn't it? Because I used to always think it was weird that people couldn't remember their age.
Yeah.
And actually, I think when you get to your late 20s, I think that's the stage where you actually struggle.
It just stops mattering because you don't count the years as anything significant because you don't want them to get any. Don't want the number to grow. But 2020 has been a weird year, so I think I'm just going to go back to being 25.
Cancel it out.
And then just 2021, I'll turn 26. So 26, I am the youth director here at Hamilton Road Baptist Church.
Brilliant.
In Bangor, sunny Bangor. I'm married to one wife, have no children, but have a very fluffy and hyperactive dog.
Good that you clarified one wife.
Yeah, one wife. It's a good principle to stick by. Other than that, I'm not a very interesting bloke, Matthew.
Well, I would beg to differ. Some people might beg to differ. How long have you been here in Bangor?
I've been here for 2 years and 5 months.
Good, and how have you enjoyed it?
It's been very good, very interesting experience, very different than my previous church experience. But got to meet some good guys like yourself and the guys who work here, and the young people are great in North Down.
Good.
Comes with its own set of wrestles and struggles, as does every location, but God willing, he just continues to bless us in this time. Yeah.
And what would you say? I remember the young people from Bangor will be maybe watching this. What's the big difference between the young people in Bangor and the young people in East Belfast, is it you're from?
North
Belfast.
The Shankill Road.
The Shankill Road.
The Shankill Road. They're softer.
In Bangor?
In Bangor. They're definitely softer. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I just mean, on a Saturday night when we rang Youth Club on the Shankill, what you would have got out of them was...
Black eyes?
Yeah, they just want to fight each other and kick a football and, wreck the lights and break the windows after. And that's probably an unfair image that I'm painting because only some of them were like that. But North Down is very different. And it's actually a lot easier to do things like discipleship with a crowd where we are at the minute. So
very good.
Yeah, very different, but a great experience.
Brilliant. And so were you working as a youth worker before you came to Bangor and Hamilton Road?
I wasn't. I was volunteering as the youth pastor at my church, and I was working full time night shift for a tech company called Cayenne.
Wow.
So it was all very technical behind the scenes, and then I was coming home, going to bed at 7:30 in the morning, sometimes 8 o'clock after eating breakfast, and then I was getting up and doing stuff for church in the afternoon, evenings, and then back to night shift that night. And obviously I just had a sense of calling on my life that God was calling me to full-time ministry, and an opportunity came up here, and I knocked the door, and God opened it for me. So
brilliant. So I'm sure those late nights were a good preparation for youth ministry.
you could ask Johnny and Keith, who work here with me. They really, it took me about a year and a half to actually adjust to getting up early. Those guys would have been having lunch at 1 o'clock, and I'd have still been in rest mode for the first 6 months. So I didn't need any meals here until probably my second year.
Oh really?
Honestly.
So your body clock's finally caught up with itself.
Finally caught up and more. And more.
Very good. What's the best thing about being a youth worker?
Best thing about being a youth worker is that you never have to grow old.
Peter Pan.
Yeah, the young people just keep you young. I think there's just something unique about seeing a young person grasp the core of the Bible, the good news of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
And while that's not a fair reflection of all youth workers, because not all youth workers work in a Christian setting, but for me, the best thing about working in a church with young people is that I get the opportunity to teach 14, 15 and upwards, even younger at times, about the good news of Jesus. And when you see that happening in a young person's life, and know that they don't have to go through all that wrestling and all of that stuff that I went through as a teenager,
Yeah.
And that they have someone there that they can confide in is really important to me. That was probably something that was missing when I was a teenager and wish that I'd had. So that's the main drive, I suppose, as to why I wanted to be a youth worker rather than just work in a church or do some other ministry.
Brilliant. And I'm sure all the challenges that young people face we'll dive into later on as we think about your life and even some of your journey into this position. But I wanted to really talk about your life, but particularly with regards to maybe a video that you actually shared probably about 3-4 months ago now. Maybe it was in the pits of lockdown. Yeah. And you released a really honest Facebook video about your own journey with mental health. And I think a lot of people responded really well to that, just because they related to a lot of what you said. Tell us a little bit about your journey with mental health, growing up maybe as a young person, a teenager yourself, and even to where it led you now.
Sure. So I've released that video when my dad had passed away on the 21st of March this year. And so it was a really dark season, and I'll get back to your question in a second. So I released that video off the back of that, just to give people context that it wasn't just a random video that I was putting out, but it was a really difficult time. Yeah. And then as a reflection of all the stuff that I'd gone through in the past as well. As a child, I always remember being an overthinker, and my dad used to laugh at me. I used to come home from school and ask the most random questions, like, "Dad, do you think there will be a nuclear war in the next 10 years?" Right? Like these really random things that no 7 or 8 year old should be thinking about. Yeah. And I always had that overactive mind, constantly thinking about worst case scenario. More often than not, it's because of what I'm seeing on the news or because of what I'm experiencing in life. Yeah. And then you go on in years, teenager. It wasn't really because of bullying or anything like that. I had lost my closest uncle whenever I was really young, probably P7 going into first year. And didn't really know how to talk about it with anyone. Our family are very much, like hardcore, bottle up your feelings and swallow your pride, or don't swallow your pride type of people. And so we never talked about it openly. We never talked about grief. We never talked about how to share that. Once the funeral was over, no one mentioned my uncle again. And that always sat heavy on me, always sat heavy on the heart. So when I was a teenager, started to notice myself sort of slipping in and out of social interaction with people. So there would have been months where I just didn't want to talk to anyone. Like went to school, put earphones in, marched around like the type of guy that was listening to My Chemical Romance, just that if you're watching a Hollywood movie, I was the guy with the earphones in and the dark hair.
Emo kid.
the emo kid. Not that I was never like an emo, but in my mindset that's where I was. So it was always felt really different. And then I think my mum and my brother noticed that there was a wee bit, there was something off, and they asked, and I told them, I just wasn't feeling right. Went and spoke to a doctor and then a counsellor, and they were saying, you have this sort of depression that's going on in your life. You can do a couple of things about it. You can continue to go to talking therapy, or you can take medication that'll sort of lull everything out to a base level of you not having any real life emotions. Yeah. And I didn't like that idea, so I didn't take any of it. And just carried on in life. And everything was good for a couple of years, but I felt like it would always come back to haunt me, which it did. Sort of 16, 17 was probably at my worst. And on a number of occasions had attempted suicide and considered suicide and thought about different ways of doing it. And actually one of the days had went to do it, and someone had rapped the door, and I thought it was my mum, so I panicked. Yeah. So if it wasn't for someone rapping my door, there may have been the chance that I wouldn't be here today. Yeah. So yeah, there's a whole lot of that just incorporated. And
at that age, obviously now a lot of people talk about mental health. It's kind of something that people are familiar with. Back then, as recent as that maybe was in the grand scheme of things, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago, if even that. Yeah. How aware were you of mental health at that point, or was it something that wasn't really on your radar? Did you think this is something that I'm struggling with and it's not really a known common issue?
No one talked about it. Yeah. And it was so strange. I just assumed it was stuff that like older people dealt with. Yeah. I remember when I was a kid, I had lost my cousin to suicide, and that was the first person that I know of in our area that had committed suicide. And so our family was just plagued with almost like this cloud of darkness for many, many years. And so there was some talk of sort of mental health stuff, but it was never talked about in terms of a young person potentially having it. It was always like, she's lost her child, or, you know, they've divorced. It was always in terms of older people. And so I never thought that it would come to my door. It was never something that was talked about, and certainly nowhere near as much as it's talked about today. So just wasn't on my radar. It kind of came as a shock and a surprise when it did happen.
And how did that then progress? That was mainly whenever you were a teenager. You're, what age are you now? I don't think you can remember.
25 stuff.
25.
Till next year.
How did that progress into your early 20s? Maybe as around that time, maybe there was a greater awareness of mental health and the challenges that it is among a lot of people.
Yeah, and this is probably where the story gets a little bit confusing. I became a Christian when I was late 17, early 18. That was when I sort of started the whole journey. When I became a Christian, the expectation in my head was everything has to change, so I can't be the depressed Bryan. You know, I can't have the mental health stuff going on behind the scenes. Everything has to be happy-go-lucky, and that was me for probably 2-3 years. Yeah. You know, I was a guy just doing really well in youth club. People were asking to do stuff, and it was great. I was being asked to do stuff in church class, signed up for Bible college, brilliant. You know, I was sharing my faith and my story and telling people I used to struggle with mental health stuff, but actually I still was, and wasn't willing to be honest enough with people, because I didn't want them thinking he's saying all this stuff that God has taken him away from all of that mental health world, but actually I'm still going through it behind the scenes. So that was difficult, early 20s, and then into when me and Claire were planning to get married, everything was changing, and you know what it's like to get married, and for those who are married know what it's like. Everything changes seemingly overnight. You go from being a single man living at your mum's house, dating someone, engaged or whatever. Everything's your own. You're basically in your own wee world, and then you give all of that up to be with your wife in a new house. For me, I'd left a job to come here, and even so then over the last 2.5 years have been difficult mentally to try to readjust and realign my life and God's purpose and all of that. Yeah,
I find it really interesting what you said there about whenever you became a Christian. I'm sure it maybe helped in ways, but in other ways the struggle was still there, but you felt that pressure to almost masquerade the struggle and pretend that it wasn't there. Talk to us a little bit about your faith, and how it did help, and how, even though you're a Christian, that struggle still exists, and how to navigate that, because maybe that's something that people listening to this podcast can relate to.
Sure. Well, let me just say the struggle will always exist, and that's not me saying that God is not capable of bringing you through some of that stuff. There are many, many testimonies of people who have said, you know, God, I was in that place and now I'm not, and that's great. But the Bible is also plagued with stories like David. Just read the Psalms. Like, it is just this guy going through life. And apart from the language, it's the exact same way. You know, it's how I feel about life. You know, like, God, where are you? Why are you so far away from me? Why do I feel like this? And then one minute it's, oh God, you are, you know, the Lord of all creation. You are my God. So that will always be there, I think, and will always be a wrestle for everyone. What was the actual question again?
In what way does it help then as well?
Yeah. It helps because our joy and our hope is not found in whether we rest mentally at night. Our joy and our hope is found only in God, and our salvation, which is the ultimate joy of this life that we as Christians have, is found in Jesus alone. And there's nothing that we can do to make that better or worse. It's the sovereignty of God that sees it through. And so when when we put all that pressure on ourselves to make life better, you know, I want to be better mentally, I want to be better physically, health-wise, all of this stuff, and those are all good things to aspire to do. Ultimately, God is sovereign and in control. And when we leave all of our humanness, which is, I believe, a lot of why we wrestle mentally as people, is because we are human. We are not without fault. And we are disconnected from God, and that's what makes us think that we should be something else in our heads and all of that stuff combined. We need to leave that at the feet of God, and that's what really helps, like that understanding of, I'm not really in control, this isn't about me, this isn't my life, I have handed it over to Christ, and so ultimately he can do what he wants with it. That's
so helpful. And as you talk about that, there probably is a perception for many people that they feel a sense of shame, maybe because they're a Christian and they wrestle with these things. But as you say, the Psalms and the Bible's covered with even just the idea of lament and being really down. You know, we just finished with Baptist Youth a series on 1 Kings, and you see Elijah, I think it's chapter 18, where he's just extremely down in the dumps under the tree. I think it's maybe chapter 19. But we've kind of maybe lost that category of feeling down, and even sometimes I think in our songs that we sing, it's always about when you're on a cloud 9 praising Jesus, but actually even sometimes we maybe lack that genre of lament and feeling low and feeling down, which there's no, I suppose, shame in. What do you think needs to change in the church? Obviously you're a youth worker, you're working with young people. What needs to change so that we are more accommodating and more open, and we can actually help the problem culturally as a church or as a youth group?
I think we need to get rid of the stigma that there is something wrong with you if you are wrestling with your mental health, and also actually coming at it from the other angle, to be really careful not to just tar yourself with the same stuff every time. You could be experiencing melancholy, which is a smaller version of, or a bad day, as most people put it now, like I'm having a bad day. It's melancholy. That's not necessarily you having an anxiety attack or being depressed. And so we all have bad days, whether you wrestle mentally or not. There are days where you get up and you don't want to go to school. There are days where you get up and you don't want to go to work or uni, and those are bad days. But when that becomes consistent, that's probably when you should talk to someone. And when it's our job as church leaders and people in church, even if you're a young person listening, it's our job to do that in a way that Jesus would have done, and not just either shy away from the topic completely or paint everybody with the same brush. We need to show love to people. We need to show compassion to people. We are also broken, whether you struggle mentally or not. We are in a broken world, and we are broken people. It all just looks very different for certain people. So I think we could do a much better job of getting rid of the stigma in church. I also think what doesn't help is that people instantly attach it to a sin issue. And that's a big theological topic, which maybe you'll cover instead of me when this is over. There are certainly elements of mental health that could be attached to the fact that you're feeling that guilt and shame because of your sin. But there's also a lot of it that is just because we are human and weak, and we are not God, and we are not perfect, and we are not in our final state, to put it easily.
I find it fascinating. I was speaking to a pastor recently who said, from a relatively big church, he said that 45% of his church membership he estimated were on antidepressants, which I thought was, like, that blew my mind, because you probably would never think that, and probably the people who are on them think that they're in the minority, and they probably, if that statistic's true, they're just about in the minority. So it's absolutely crazy. Take us back then to this year, or the start of this year, when your dad passed away. How did that maybe then bring back a lot of that struggle, and how did you find coping with that? Obviously it's still a process, but what's helped you along the way of dealing with grief particularly?
I think it was a different kind of struggle, and the reason why, previously I always wondered why I struggled. Like, why do I feel like this morning? Why do I not want, why is it I can't speak to that person? Versus when my dad passed away in March, I knew why I felt how I did, and so it was different, and it was that grief rather than a mental health wrestle or struggle or whatever way you want to paint it. But it didn't make it any easier. It was probably the hardest season of life I've ever been through, even through all of the mental health stuff that I've been through in the past. That's currently the hardest, and even this now. I mean, Christmas is coming up, and that'll be the first Christmas without my dad, first New Year, and then by the time we know it, it'll be a whole year from my dad passed away. Yeah. So this has been the hardest season of life I think I've ever been in, and I had to come to a point where I just had to accept the season that I'm in. I think our tendency is, like you said, to always want to be on cloud nine, to always want to feel like, oh, I feel the Holy Spirit today, like I feel like I really want to read the Bible. I woke up some mornings and just like could barely even speak to my wife, never mind want to open my Bible and pray to a God who I had questions for. I would have loved 3 months ago if God could have came and sat and done this podcast with me so that I could just ask him all the questions that I had about my dad and about what life was about. And I think going a bit further back, I would have been one of the people who would have said, I know what to say to someone who's going through grief. And you maybe experience this working with people, and anybody who works with people will know this. It's all good and well being able to talk about it, but when it comes to your own door, you have to deal with it not only up here, but in your heart and your emotions and the actual physical stress that comes along with grief and mental health stuff. So yeah, it's been a hard season, but what has really helped has been that community aspect of just people understanding that I don't want them to turn up to my door and say like, oh, the Lord has blessed you. Some people just really understood, like he just needs us to see if he needs food today. Yeah. You know, he needs a phone call to see if, you know, he needs any shopping, or, you know, do you have anything to watch on TV tonight? Yeah. You know, just simple conversations. Yeah. Don't try and solve the problem. Just don't try and solve the problem. Just be there, and that's really important. Yeah, a listening ear and a faithful presence. I think I read in an article somewhere I thought was helpful. Yeah. So I'm sure it's been helpful, even for your young people, having the perspective that you bring to mental health and your own struggles. Talk to us a little bit about then your perspective as a youth worker and working with young people and how they struggle with mental health, and maybe how it's more prominent now than it was when you were younger, or is it more prominent now than when you were younger, or is it just, are we more aware of it now? I think it's more prominent and we're significantly more aware. So probably both. The latest statistic from the health agency, public health agency, is that 1 in 3 young people in Northern Ireland recognise that they have went through some sort of mental wrestle, struggle. Again, I don't want to paint it with a certain word, but they have struggled at some point. 1 in 3. Yeah. Means if you've 30 young people in a building, which at the minute we're capped to because of COVID, 10 of them are potentially going through. I know that's not how statistics always work out, but you get the pattern. Like 1 in 3 is a big number. Yeah. I also think about the over exaggeration of the culture that we live in is heavily over exaggerated. Yeah. And that worries me, because when you have streamers, YouTubers, celebrities, sports people all saying it's okay not to be okay, it's okay to wrestle, like I've wrestled, look at my scars, we've wrestled, look at our lives, it almost paints us this image of the person who wrestles as the hero. And that worries me, because how many people are wrestling now because they want to be the hero? Yeah. And I hope that that's a minority, but I know in some cases that young people have maybe been watching something and they think, you know what, it's almost a heroic thing to do, to be wrestling with an eating disorder or self-harm, or just perpetually having bad days and telling people that you're having bad days.
Yeah.
And this quote, "It's okay not to be okay," is good in theory.
Yeah.
But actually, as a Christian, as a 26-year-old man who has went through some of that stuff, it's actually not. It's not okay. It's just not the purpose of our life. The purpose of our lives is not for us to grow up really, really struggling and then get to a certain point and then be happy. Like, you don't have to struggle as a young person. You don't have to be one of those 1 in 3. And so I just really take aim at that. It's okay not to be okay. It is okay not to be okay in the sense that if you speak to someone, if a young person comes in here tonight and speaks to me about struggling mentally, I'm not going to say to them, "That's not okay for you to be struggling." That's not what I mean. I mean, don't just sit in it. Like, if you're actually struggling with some stuff, or you're hurting yourself in some way, or you've got pain mentally, speak to someone who can help. Don't wait around like I and so many others did. Because I have seen the worst case scenario. I grew up playing football and played on a football team, of which now 6 of the members of the football team are now dead to suicide.
Honestly, wow.
And so I know, but they never spoke about it. They never spoke about, "Oh, I'm not feeling great," and they get wrapped up in so much stuff, and then that's the outcome. And I don't want that to ever be the outcome for young people here in North Down or in Belfast or anywhere. We need to get rid of that culture of this is okay and it's almost a good thing to wrestle. Yeah, it's not, because that's not how life's supposed to be.
Yeah. We're made for more as one organisation. We plug out for Made for More. I'm sure social media has a big role to play in the increase of mental health issues. Do you want to speak into that at all?
How long have you got? I have a real love-hate relationship with social media, because it's so effective. Like, you will put this on social media and hopefully someone will watch it and it'll be really helpful. I follow hundreds of churches on YouTube and on Facebook and Instagram who are doing a great job of spreading the gospel through the airwaves. But then I also know that 13-year-old girls are looking at 25-year-old girls who have spent £100 photoshopping their image from holiday, and they look quote unquote perfect, or a 10 out of 10. And how does that make the 13-year-old feel? And that's at its root issue. The root issue is idolatry, that we desire to be something that we're not, that we don't accept that we are mere humans, and that God is God. But there's a whole lot of stuff that comes along with the social media that we probably...
It strikes me what you said earlier about whenever you were young, like a young boy or whatever, and you always asked your dad those strange questions about, like, are we going to get nuked or something like that. I suppose that's one thing. I remember speaking to Colin Cooper about this, who obviously works for the association in the mental health area. He said that, kind of similar to what you said, that we worry now even more. We're more informed in many ways due to social media and due to the news, and everything's instant. We've got so much information. We do hear all these rumours, we see all the fake news. Any issue in the world, we hear about it, whereas maybe even when you were growing up, your information was, I suppose, North Belfast. Someone
whatever
who was...
my teachers told me.
Yeah, whatever your teachers told you, that was your only source of information. Whereas now you see all the rumours of, there's going to be a civil war, there's going to be World War III, there's going to be this, that. I suppose the more you know, the worse off you can be.
And I think even in terms of if there are any youth leaders watching, that can be hard for us as youth leaders then. I've used the term before, young people are over entertained and under impressed. Like, if they're watching TikTok for 2 hours, they will get fed up pretty quickly, and then they can just go straight on the Instagram, or they can go on the Netflix or Amazon Prime or Facebook or YouTube, and they are over entertained because everybody's trying to win their attention. But they're under impressed because then when they come to us on a Friday night and we try to do something that connects them on a human level, and also try to share the gospel, which is something that they've already heard 100 times.
Yeah.
Because they grew up in church. They're just going, this is stuff I've heard before. I need something new. And so that I just find that part
very
difficult.
very challenging.
Yeah.
What about 2020 then? Obviously 2020 has been a challenging year, and one of the big debates whenever we talk about lockdowns, all the different factors that need to come into play, one of which has been brought to the table is mental health. How's 2020 from your experience of your own life, working with young people, what you see around you, how has it been detrimental to mental health?
Initially, when lockdown came, I remember me and Claire were lying watching Boris Johnson address the nation, and Claire actually said to me, how weird is it that now, like, mental health went from being the hot topic to something that just doesn't exist anymore.
Mm-hmm.
She was like, where are all the people who were dealing with mental health struggles? And it sort of made me go, well, where did they go? But actually they didn't go anywhere. The narrative had just changed to, obviously the global pandemic affects the globe.
Mm-hmm.
People's mental health affects them and their close family and friends.
Yeah. So
there was a priority shift in how that changes, but I think there will be a real I suppose drop in people's good mental health after this lockdown.
Yeah.
Funding's getting pulled left, right and centre. There's less available to people. People can't go and see people physically. It's harder to exercise. They can't do things socially. There's going to be less resources for them. In terms of young people, they're going to be told, and not by me or I hope by you or anybody that I know, but eventually the narrative will become, oh yeah, there's a pandemic on and you're worried about these small things, and that's almost the image it's painted for me. It's the most important thing is the pandemic. Meanwhile, these young people could be sitting at home really wrestling with their thoughts. So it's a huge year. We don't really know what it's going to look like in the next 5 years. I don't think anyone knows what closing the schools for so long will have done to young people. Closing everything socially, telling them that they aren't allowed to go outside. We don't know. It's
crazy because I mean I wouldn't say that in my story mental health's been a major struggle. I suppose we all struggle in different ways with it, and we've all got our unique struggles. But even for me, the past probably month, 6 weeks, I've been like, this is tough. Like it takes a toll on you. So I can only imagine those who are prone to have struggled in the past, the struggles that they must have been facing in this time. So it's definitely one which will have taken its toll. Just as we close things up, tell us a little bit about if you had to give some words of wisdom to a young person. I'm sure there'll be someone watching this who, maybe not even a young person, maybe an older person who is struggling. What would your top tips be? Or your pieces of advice? Maybe top tips isn't a bit...
Life always gets better. Well, I actually, as much as that's not biblical, so sorry for any theologians who are watching.
Well, it does if you're a Christian, it'll ultimately get better.
Ultimately, yeah, and that's kind of where I'm heading with it. It's almost like the cheesiest mental health quote you've ever heard, but you doing something drastic because you're wrestling mentally eliminates life ever getting better. But if you stay in the game, life can get better and probably will. If you get the right help and if you get maybe even the right medication, speak to the right people. It doesn't always have to be on a downward spiral because you feel like rubbish now. There is hope. There is hope if you are a Christian, obviously, in Jesus, that assured salvation that you should have if you follow him. And that hope does not rest on you feeling okay every day. That hope rests on what Jesus done at the cross. And that's the only place that we can leave that. there's also hope if you're not a Christian. You can know that God. And it's not that it's not hard to do. It is hard to do and requires massive sacrifice. Requires you to give up everything. But when you do that, you'll be giving up everything for assurance and joy and hope and security and ultimately salvation. And I think, I guess just in terms of what I would advise young people, like a young person to do, teenager, young adult, whatever, is to know yourself well, to know when you can feel yourself slipping back again. And that was something that took me a long time to realise. I thought, you know, things were rubbish and then they got better, and I was like, oh, well then they'll always be the way they are now. And then you slowly slip back into that. So knowing yourself, knowing God, knowing your assurances in Jesus, and learning how to be resilient. We live in a culture that does not enjoy delayed gratification. Yeah. If you watched any of the lockdown videos about people leaving sweets in front of their children and their dogs and then going out of the room, all of that speaks into this generation that we live in, that people don't like delayed gratification. Honestly, see if you're someone who's wrestling with your thoughts and discontentment with life particularly, practice resilience, practice delayed gratification. Set yourself a goal, and just because you don't achieve it tomorrow, don't give up. Just keep going. Keep going. We could probably talk all day.
Tease it out. Well, Bryan, thank you for joining us. Really appreciate it. This is a very important topic, but I think it's particularly helpful that someone like you, who's a youth worker and is working with young people, can share in your own journey with it, and even confess, as you have done here, that it's still a journey that you're on. And I think that's really powerful and really helpful. So thank you for joining us, and thank you to everyone who's tuned in to watching this, and hope that you enjoyed it, hope you got something from it, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.